When Justin Trudeau became the leader of the Liberal Party, the party just had their worst electoral performance in history. And with a number of issues plaguing the governments of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin, getting trust back wouldn't be easy. On top of that, the new Democratic Party was challenging the Liberals on their left, and the conservative forces had teamed up to create a unified right that looked to be unstoppable. But with building the Liberal Party as well as his image, Justin Trudeau was able to go from worst to first with an impressive win in the 2015 Canadian federal election, which would eventually see him serve longer as Prime Minister than giants like Lester Pearson, John Diefenbaker, and Brian Mulroney. Today's video is about that election and the start of Justin Trudeau's rise. Now, before we start, I want to thank all of those who are subscribed to the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click the subscribe button down below, as growing this channel will really help in the algorithm. If you would like to help out more, you can become a member of my Patreon. I want to thank all of my current Patreon members. The link in the description is down below if you would like to donate to the channel. And with that, now on to today's video. To understand the Liberal Party's victory in 2015, thus the rise of Justin Trudeau, it's important to understand the political situation in Canada between the 2011 and 2015 elections. The 2011 election was one of the most interesting in Canadian history. Ever since the consolidation of the Progressive Conservative Party and the Reform Party in 2003, which created a unified right for the first time since Brian Mulroney in 1988, it was hard for the center-left Liberal Party to compete. Yes, they won the 2004 election with Prime Minister Paul Martin winning his first mandate, but that was only a minority government that lasted less than 2 years. In 2006, the Conservatives, led by Stephen Harper, defeated Martin's Liberals, but they couldn't reach a majority. The same thing happened in 2008, with the Conservatives gaining more seats, but not enough for a majority. But a number of questionable spending decisions by the Conservatives during the 2008 election led to a motion of no confidence introduced in Parliament by Michael Ignatieff, now the leader of the Liberal Party. But this motion was a double-edged sword. Yes, the motion passing would lead to the triggering of a new election. However, the Conservatives were leading in all the polls and could possibly win a majority. This was a worry for Jack Layton, leader of the New Democrats, or the NDP from this point forward. He either had to vote for the no confidence motion, which could lead to a Conservative majority, or he would vote against it, which would lead to the Conservatives in power but guarantee them a minority government. Layton voted for the motion, the writ was dropped, and the Conservatives won their majority. The biggest surprise in that election was the NDP coming in a strong second place, with their biggest gains in Quebec. Many of those gains in Quebec were at the expense of the separatist Bloc Québécois, who went from holding 47 seats before the election to only 4, with Bloc leader Gilles Duceppe losing his own riding. As for the Liberals, they finished third in their worst electoral performance ever, now down to only 34 seats, losing over 101 seats since Paul Martin won in 2004. After the 2011 election, each one of the major political parties went through drastic changes. First, let's start with the Conservatives. Now holding a majority of 11 seats, the party started moving more toward the right, even on social issues. Before 2011, one could make the argument that the Progressive Conservative and Reform wings of the party had somewhat equal influence, with Reform slightly more influential. But by 2011, the party was firmly to the right. After the merger in 2003, some more centrist MPs left the party, like Scott Bryson and later Belinda Stronach. But one person, Peter MacKay, who was leader of the Progressive Conservatives at the time of the merger, and who was also dating Belinda Stronach, sounded more like Stephen Harper than anything that had resembled the old Progressive Conservatives. And as time passed, the valley between the center and the right wing of the party was widening, with the party starting to lean harder into identity politics. Kelly Leach, the labor minister under Harper, worked with immigration minister Chris Alexander to create a tip line for the RCMP where people could report what they considered barbaric cultural practices, mimicking something that you would hear from the current administration in the White House. We'll come back to that later. While nobody would openly oppose Harper on these social issues, many conservative frontbenchers wouldn't push these policies either. Many in the media were questioning the direction of the party with growing discontent amongst Canadians, with the Conservatives polling at around 31% 2 years after the 2011 election, in which they won 39.6% of the vote. And one person that didn't help was Paul Calandra, the parliamentary secretary to the prime minister. However, his approach was more like that of Baghdad Bob, who many of you might know as the Iraqi minister of information during the Iraq War, who said that everything was fine. Calandra wasn't far off, saying that everything was great and stubbornly stuck with the party line, even if it was verifiably false. Along with Calandra's appearances, Harper was criticized for not making himself available to the media, with his party even attacking the CBC as a politically biased organization. Essentially, the Conservatives in Canada were looking more like the Republicans in American politics. Now, let's go over to the NDP and the enormous changes that the party went through during this interelection period. Now, it has to be said that the NDP has two of the most beloved politicians in Canadian history. The first one is Tommy Douglas, grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland and father of Canada's universal healthcare system. The second was Jack Layton, who became the leader of the official opposition after the NDP's Orange Wave in 2011. In an Ipsos poll released just a little under a year before the 2011 election, Jack Layton was seen as someone who was open to the idea of others by a plurality of Canadians. While Layton might not have been someone that everyone agreed with politically, he was seen as someone who wanted to do the best for Canada and wasn't simply a politician. In this way, he was quite similar to Tommy Douglas. But before the 2011 election, Layton announced that he had prostate cancer on February 5, 2010. By March of 2011, Layton said that his prostate cancer has virtually disappeared, but he did have hip surgery which required him to walk with a cane, which would become a symbol of his campaign. But the NDP's surge in Quebec is mostly attributed to Jack Layton's performance on Tout le monde en parle, which is Quebec's highest rated talk show. Essentially, a good performance on this program and a party will do well in Quebec. That's exactly what happened. Prior to the election, the only MP for the NDP from Quebec was Thomas Mulcair from Outremont. But now the NDP won 103 seats in Parliament, with 59 of those being in Quebec. In fact, the strength of the NDP in Quebec was such a shock that one of their candidates, Ruth Ellen Brosseau, who was running in a riding that was 97% French speaking, was an Anglophone who had a working knowledge of French but was not fluent in the language. On top of that, she didn't even live in the riding, but instead lived in Gatineau, as living where you run is not required in Canada. During the campaign, she never visited the riding or actively campaigned for the position. She didn't expect to win, and prior to the election, she even booked a trip to Las Vegas for her birthday before Harper called the election. Well, while in Las Vegas, she was elected as a member of parliament. Four McGill students who also didn't expect to win were also elected to parliament, being dubbed the McGill Four. I mention this because it showed just how dominant the NDP were in Quebec, as voters would just elect any NDP candidate to the alternative. But just 3 months after the victory, things were about to take a tragic turn. On July 3rd, 2011, Layton attended the Toronto Pride Parade, with everything seemingly going well and looking healthy. But 22 days later, on July 25th, a much thinner and visibly weaker Layton held a press conference. With a much weaker voice than normal, he announced that his prostate cancer was still in remission, but that he was suffering from a new cancer that has never been disclosed since. He remained as leader of the official opposition, but appointed Nicole Turmel as the interim leader. However, Layton would die less than a month later on August 22nd, 2011. In a poll conducted in 2022 by Polera, 28.2% of Canadians say that Layton was the best official opposition leader who never became prime minister, with Lucien Bouchard finishing second, significantly behind at 5.3%. Even 11 years later, Layton remained popular and is still popular today. Of course, a leadership race needed to be held. A number of candidates ran for the position, but three main names were in consideration: MP Nathan Cohen, who was seen as more center left; NDP President Brian Topp, who was seen as the most left leaning of the three candidates with support from the old timers in the party; and MP Thomas Mulcair, who had strong backing throughout the party, especially with many of the new MPs elected from Quebec. Though Cullen could be considered one of the main candidates, he always ran behind Topp and Mulcair in the polls. Topp wanted to bring back the left-leaning days of Ed Broadbent, while Mulcair wanted to bring the party more to the center. And for some in the NDP, this was a criticism of Layton, as some saw him as moving away from its social democratic core and becoming more centrist. He was seen as some in the mold of Bob Hawke in Australia, shifting right over time. The leadership race would go 4 ballots, but Mulcair led in every ballot, eventually being elected the new leader. In the nearly 4 years that Mulcair was the opposition leader, he would be quite effective and present on the floor of the House. In fact, after his election, the NDP remained tied with the Conservatives in the polls conducted between March and October of 2012, but then fell behind, much like what happened to the NDP with Audrey McLaughlin, which you can learn more about in this video. But with the ever-present Mulcair on television making the NDP's case, their support spread throughout Canada. On June 5th, 2015, more than 3 months before the election, the NDP took the lead in the ECOS poll, with ECOS saying that the NDP had regained dominance in Quebec and had now become a pan-Canadian party, with support in every province and a sharp rise in Ontario. From the June 5th poll until the writ was dropped on August 2nd, the NDP dominated the polls, with only one poll from Main Street Research showing the Conservatives with an 11-point lead. There is a reason for this bounce, which we will come back to later. And with that, it's now time to talk about the Liberals. As I mentioned earlier, Michael Ignatieff led the Liberals to their worst defeat in the party's history, with only 34 members elected in 2011. So it was obvious that Ignatieff had to go and that a new leader was needed to move the party forward. Interestingly, when Ignatieff resigned, Bob Rae, former NDP Premier of Ontario, became the interim leader, though declined to run for the position. But it wasn't just Rae, but a number of high-profile Liberals that decided not to run, including Scott Bryson, Jean Charest, Dominic LeBlanc, the McGuinty brothers, Frank McKenna, and Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney. The first candidate to enter the race for the Liberal leadership was Deborah Coyne, who had worked in the Prime Minister's office of Brian Mulroney and who took on Jack Layton in the riding of Toronto-Danforth, losing to Layton by 14%. So yeah, she probably wasn't likely to become the next party leader. The second candidate to enter the race was the Member of Parliament from the riding of Papineau, Justin Trudeau, son of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Trudeau made his announcement on October 2012. Almost immediately, Trudeau was able to consolidate support from current and former MPs, making it hard for anyone else to continue. Not only was Trudeau one of the only high-profile members of the Liberal Party still in Parliament, mostly because of his last name if we want to be honest, but he was also one of the first candidates in the world to use short-form social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter to build his image. Nationally, he had strong support, as well as within the Liberal Party. So yes, he was extremely popular. When Bob Rae announced that he wasn't going to run in June, Trudeau was dominating the polls with nobody close to him. The closest candidate to Trudeau, but who was still significantly behind, was Marc Garneau, current MP for Westmount Ville-Marie and a former astronaut. However, he ended his leadership run a few weeks before the leadership convention and endorsed Justin Trudeau. Trudeau easily won on the first ballot, winning 80.1% of the votes, with the second place candidate, Joyce Murray, an MP from British Columbia, winning 10.2%. The dominant performance, as well as the social and conventional media attention, significantly helped the Liberals in the polls. Once Trudeau became party leader, the First Forum research poll had the Liberals at 43% support, 13% ahead of the Conservatives. And while they might not have had that big of a lead in subsequent polls, the Liberals consistently led in an overwhelming majority of the polls between Trudeau's election as leader in April 2014 all the way until December of 2014, with the Liberals and Conservatives swapping places in most of the polls. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals were getting all of the attention and sucking all of the oxygen out of the room for the other parties. That included the NDP, which started to slide in the polls. But remember, I said that I would come back to the rise in the polls in June of 2015? Well, now we're at that point. On May 5th, 2015, one of the biggest political shockwaves in Canadian political history happened in the province of Alberta. The Alberta New Democratic Party swept into power during the 2015 Alberta general election, winning 54 seats, with only 44 needed for a majority. The new premier of Alberta was Rachel Notley, daughter of Grant Notley, who was also leader of the NDP but died in a plane crash in 1984. Notley replaced progressive conservative premier Jim Prentice, who would also die in a plane crash a year later. Seriously, a lot of people die in plane crashes in the videos I make. Anyway, the NDP beat the Progressive Conservatives as well as the Wild Rose Party, a right wing conservative party in Alberta whose previous leader was Danielle Smith, who actually left the party for the PCs. As for Notley, she wasn't the same as other elected NDPers, as she was much more moderate than a lot of other at the federal and provincial level. For example, she was much more moderate on the environment, as Alberta relied on the oil industry. Saying that you wanted to limit the oil industry made a party unelectable. She even supported building pipelines, which the federal NDP opposed. But as we discussed earlier, Mulcair was seen as moving the NDP toward the center of the political spectrum. This also helped in the polls as well, as with Audrey McLaughlin benefiting in the polls from the election of Bob Rae as Premier of Ontario, which led to the NDP leading in the polls for a while actually. The same happened for the NDP with Notley's win, with the NDP now leading in the pre-election polls. Most of the polls between June and the time that the writ was dropped on August 2nd, the NDP led anywhere from 1 to 8%. Going into the election, it looked as if it was going to be a battle between the Conservatives and the NDP for control of the minority government, with the Liberals finishing a respectable third. And with that, let's get into the election. As I've already mentioned, the writ was dropped on August 2nd, with the election being held on October 19th. This would make it the longest federal election campaign in Canadian history, with many in the media shocked at how long it was going to take. Of course, many of us in the United States laughed and rolled our eyes, thinking, oh, that's cute. Such a long campaign. Now, let's look at the campaign strategies for each of the parties, with the sources in the reference document link in the description. First, let's start with the Conservative Party. Throughout the campaign, Conservative Party spokesman Corey Tonight outlined the major themes of the campaign. First, they wanted to focus on Stephen Harper's experience, saying that he was the only tested leader and that he would be able to handle the challenges that faced Canada. This was especially the argument when it came to the economy, saying that both Mulcair and Trudeau were not strong when it came to this issue. Additionally, they labeled Mulcair as a high tax risk and always used the example of Bob Rae as Ontario's NDP premier in the 1990s. But to be fair, every campaign uses Bob Rae as the NDP's punching bag in federal elections, though he was just the interim leader for the Liberal Party and is still with the Liberals today. But one thing to remember about Corey Tonight was that he was the former vice president of the Sun News Network, Canada's attempt at creating something like Fox News, which failed spectacularly, only lasting less than 4 years. With this, the Conservatives still focused on socially conservative issues, trying to tie them in with national security. This would eventually lead to the aforementioned barbaric practices hotline being introduced during the campaign on October 2nd. But according to Jenny Byrne in a post election analysis, the Conservatives knew that their support was stable and expected the NDP and Liberals to split the center left votes in enough ridings to win the election. She also said that the reason that the writ was dropped early was because the Conservatives had a financial and organizational superiority over the other parties. And when Stephen Harper opened his campaign, his focus was on stability, experience, fiscal responsibility, and the inexperience of Mulcair and Trudeau, especially Trudeau, with Conservatives even running an ad that slammed his qualifications but said that he had nice hair. Here's that video.
Well, some interesting resumes we have here. Let's talk about Justin.
I see he's included his picture. Let's start with the experience section. Nothing about balancing a budget or making a payroll.
Didn't he say budgets balance themselves?
And what does the experience section say about keeping us safe?
Well, he wants to send winter jackets to Syria.
Like that will stop ISIS?
He's like a celebrity. He says things before thinking them through.
So what are his policies?
Legalizing marijuana. Is that the biggest problem we have to solve?
He has some growing up to do.
And he says he's going to cancel income splitting for families.
I guess pension splitting for seniors is next. So when has he ever had to make a tough choice?
People, being prime minister is not an entry-level job.
I'm not saying no forever, but not now.
Nice hair though.
Justin Trudeau. He's just not ready.
If the Conservatives were to be challenged, they expected this to come from the Liberals and not the NDP. This now brings us to the NDP. Obviously, the situation was vastly different than it was in 2011. Their charismatic leader was gone, and even though Thomas Mulcair wasn't necessarily the most charismatic leader, he did build a reputation on being a strong debater during Prime Minister question period, with him being one of the most effective opposition leaders in modern Canadian history. It was this performance that the NDP depended on in order to win and create the first ever NDP federal government in Canadian history. But one of the problems that being an effective opposition leader brings is that it can make someone come across as angry. Mulcair was no exception. Anne McGrath, the NDP's national campaign director, and Brad Levine, a senior campaign advisor closely connected to Jack Layton, knew that they needed to get rid of the angry Tom image and focus on making Mulcair look calm and more like a prime minister instead of an opposition leader. But there was also another systemic problem that the NDP had when it came to their image in Canada. In every political cycle, the NDP had always been the odd party out, the party that was mostly seen as a protest vote against the Liberals or the Progressive Conservatives, now the Conservatives. Therefore, part of the NDP's strategy was to shed this image of simply being a protest vote and being a government in waiting. Of course, one of the problems with this was that the NDP had a lot of ministers in waiting that were virtually unknown to the public. Yes, some of the big names like Paul Dewar, Nathan Cullen, Megan Leslie, Peter Stauffer, Charlie Angus, and others were very prominent in the English-speaking media. But when it came to the French-speaking media, very few prominent members popped up, with the most prominent members being François Boivin, Alexandre Boldris, Guy Caron, Yvon Gaudin, and Nicole Turmel. Yes, these were all very smart and competent future ministers, but not as well known as the names that the Liberals, Bloc Québécois, and even the Conservatives could produce in Quebec. And this is where the NDP was kind of in a catch-22 situation. Yes, the Quebec MPs were the ones that put the party into the position of official opposition, but those who were the face of the party were mostly Anglophones, which might make it harder for the NDP to maintain their grip in Quebec. Of course, their strategy was to keep their Quebec seats, but also expand in both British Columbia and Ontario, trying to move outside of London, Windsor, and Hamilton. When it came to policy, the party championed a national childcare program, which would be funded by higher corporate taxes while reducing taxes on smaller businesses. They also spoke about environmental reforms, but the Greens really had cornered that market. That was even more so when Bruce Heyer, a former NDP minister since 2008, became an independent in 2012 and eventually became the second member of parliament for the Greens in 2013. Interestingly, though, Heyer left the NDP because he supported ending Canada's gun registry, something that many in the party supported, especially in Quebec. So, yes, an NDP MP left and became a member of a party that was further to the left because he was further to the right of the NDP on the gun issue. Gotta love Canadian politics. Oh, and in Canada, party switching isn't as big of a deal and is much more common than in the US. Finally, this brings us to the Liberals. Now, I'm not trying to sound flippant here, but the only thing that Justin Trudeau had was a last name and an Instagram account. Seriously, this was part of the campaign. Remember, Justin Trudeau had been in the public eye since his father was prime minister back in the 1980s, and voters in Canada had a very strong feeling toward the Trudeau name, whether for or against. However, the Instagram thing is important. As I mentioned earlier, Trudeau was one of the first politicians to actively use social media and not just have an internet presence. In a study done by communications professors Mario Lalonchette and Vincent Reynaud, they found that Trudeau's use of Instagram not only helped him reach more voters, but allowed Trudeau and the Liberal Party to control the narrative and image around Trudeau. Lalonchette and Renault said that Trudeau's positive social media presence also led to more positive media coverage of Trudeau. In their study, they said that, quote, it can be argued that the overreaching theme of the narrative was that he presented himself as an open, approachable, and authentic leader, end quote. They also added that Trudeau was able to frame himself as, quote, family-oriented, approachable, and relatable, but also involved and in control of matters of importance to the audience at the local, provincial, national, and international levels, end quote. But it was also helped by his general overall kindness. One photo that went viral in 2014 was when Justin Trudeau was in the Montreal Metro, when he helped a man in a wheelchair down the stairs as the escalator was not working. And as someone who lived in Montreal during my master's degree, escalators not working is basically par for the course in the Metro, and is worse than any other Metro that I've experienced, honestly. But what was the Liberal Party's strategy beyond simply being on Instagram? When Trudeau took over the party, he brought in Gerald Butts and Katie Telford to reshape the party. Part of that reshaping process was for the Liberals to have a presence in every province and not just limiting themselves to certain metropolitan areas, which is basically what the NDP had done in Ontario. Therefore, the Liberals built up their riding associations and started having those associations contacting and identifying voters, a process that they did more than a year before the election. But it was more than just organization. They had a young leader who was much younger and energetic than the other party leaders, which meant that he was able to travel around Canada and hold more public events than the others. And his message, of course, was very optimistic, sounding like the hope and change that helped Barack Obama to the White House in 2008. But there was something unconventional that the Liberals did. Instead of making only positive promises, even though the term sunny days would become synonymous with their campaign, the Liberals also said that the country needed to run temporary deficits for economic recovery. And this was planned as they assumed that the Conservatives were going to attack Trudeau for pie-in-the-sky ideas. With Trudeau saying that he was going to run temporary deficits, it would be hard for the Conservatives to say that Trudeau was only saying what voters wanted to hear. Geographically, as I mentioned, they were trying to build their operation nationwide, but there was still a plan. First, the campaign wanted to dominate in Atlantic Canada, where the Conservatives and the NDP had been performing well over the years. Of course, they needed to do well in Ontario, as any government formed would almost certainly have to win the most seats in Ontario. As for the rest of the country, they wanted to keep what they had, but they also wanted to try to win a seat in each province, as it would give them nationwide legitimacy and not make them just look like a regional party, which was one of the problems that the NDP had, and to some extent the Conservatives. The first debate was held just a few days after the writ was dropped on August 6th, which was the Maclean's debate in English, with Harper, Mulcair, Trudeau, and May attending. Duceppe was not at this debate. Overall, most of the political pundits after the debate said that each candidate did what was needed to be done. Harper was the punching bag by the other candidates, but was able to stand his ground. But the candidate that had the most to lose was Justin Trudeau, as nobody knew if he would have a good or bad performance. Not only was he able to hold his own, but showed that he was qualified to be on the debate stage. The polls going into the first debate essentially had the NDP, Liberals, and Conservatives tied, and that basically stayed that way throughout August. Now, there is one incident that we need to talk about, and that's the investigation into Mike Duffy, a senator who was involved with a scandal in which he used Senate travel and expense funds for things that were not approved. During the campaign, the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright, testified that he paid Senator Duffy $90,172 to pay back the money that Duffy spent. This would be an ongoing issue during the campaign. And while it might not have had an immediate impact during the testimony, poll numbers were showing that it was taking a toll on Stephen Harper, with a Forum Research poll showing that 56% of Canadians didn't believe Harper when it came to his knowledge of the Duffy scandal. But remember what Jenny Burns said, that the support the Conservatives had was stable and their plan relied on the NDP and Liberal split into center-left and left votes. So even if Harper was looked at as less favorable, he still had his supporters in his corner. And throughout the campaign, it never seemed like the Conservatives wanted to expand their base. But there was one episode that did cause a little bit of a problem regarding Duffy and the Conservatives. See, while Trudeau was coming across as this compassionate Canadian, the Conservatives had a problem with their image, coming across as rude and obnoxious. This wasn't helped when a supporter at a Stephen Harper event said this.
So wait a second, why do you think that he has no right to ask about the deal? He believes that Mr. Harper knew. Why do you think Mr. Harper didn't know anything?
Because it isn't a deal. It's a nothing. Harper doesn't read income tax forms, you idiot. It's done by the people in the tax department.
But you don't believe that anybody else in that office knew about this deal
I
and
believe
kept
that
it
you
from?
cheat more on your taxes than Duffy ever did.
Why would you say I cheat on my
Because you're
taxes?
a lying piece of shit.
Oh.
Yeah, and you too.
Why would you
What?
say that?
You're making an issue out of Duffy? He's a nothing.
He's in the court
Harper
right
has
now.
produced
He's
good
in-
government.
He's in the court
It's
right now.
nothing.
He's
It's
but if
nothing.
But
It's
if he
zero.
knew, but
Nothing.
so he's
Zero.
But if he knew, do you believe that any other people in the office knew about
I think
this?
you're a piece of lying shit, and your media with you.
What's your name?
Yeah, I totally forgot about this until doing the research for this video. Anyway, Corey tonight apologized for the outburst and said that supporters at future events would be reminded of appropriate decorum. One group of voters that the Liberals were also trying to win support of was women. Yes, Justin had nice hair, but he was essentially the only candidate talking about women's issues. A debate was set up by an organization called Up for Debate, which was going to focus on women's issues. Harper said that he was not going to attend the debate, but Mulcair followed, saying that he too would not attend the debate because it didn't make sense to have a debate without the Prime Minister. This led to a backlash against both parties. Elizabeth May, Gilles Duceppe, and Justin Trudeau all agreed to attend. Because Harper wasn't there, they changed the format to a set of interviews, which Mulcair agreed to attend. May slammed both Mulcair and Harper, saying that this was the first time that a women's issue debate could have been held in decades, but two men stopped the debate. It's at this point where polling starts to show women shifting over from the NDP to the Liberals. It was also at the end of September when the Liberals started talking about running the government deficits that I mentioned earlier. At the same time, Mulcair was talking about having balanced budgets if the NDP were elected as government. This saw a crossing over of both parties on the spending issue, with the NDP now further to the right than the Liberals on this issue. Toronto Star columnist Chantal Bears said, quote, "Time will tell whether Trudeau has just steered the party over a cliff or set a course that will see it home and dry on election night. One way or another, the Liberal ship has sailed and there can be no rowing back to the zero deficit shore." End quote. So, yes, making this pledge was a big risk for Trudeau, but as I mentioned earlier, it was all part of the Liberal plan. But there was also a flip side to this plan. With Trudeau saying that he would have to put the government into deficit, it also meant that he could pledge not to raise taxes on individuals. But with the NDP saying that they were going to have a balanced budget, both the Liberals and Conservatives attacked the NDP, saying that the only way that they would be able to accomplish a balanced budget is by raising taxes. Because remember, the NDP did want to offer childcare programs and other increases in social safety nets. But there was one image that was about to change the campaign, and it wasn't even from Canada. The image was of a Syrian boy washed up on the shore of Greece after drowning being in a refugee boat. The boy, Alan Kurdi, and his family had been trying to reach Canada by going through Europe from Syria, as they had family in Canada. The family had been trying for months to get the child, as well as his brother and mother, to Canada for months, yet the Canadian government did nothing. Had Canada given them permission, it would have been much easier for their transition. Of course, with the harsh stance that the Harper government had on immigration, especially Chris Alexander and Kelly Leach, Harper's compassion didn't come across well. As far as Thomas Mulcair, he focused more on the issue from a foreign policy perspective, but didn't mention the family as much. As for Justin Trudeau, he gave a very passionate speech. He didn't necessarily point fingers at anyone, but said that there needed to be answers. But in his speech, his focus seemed to be more on the refugee crisis instead of the political crisis. On September 6, 2015, in a speech in Laval, Quebec, Trudeau asked for the party leaders to come together to talk about Canada's response to the refugee crisis. A few days later, the Liberal Party saw their first lead in the Nanos tracking poll on September 8th, with the Liberals at 32.5%, the NDP at 31.2%, and the Conservatives at 25.9%. A few days later, Linton Crosby, a political consultant who helped the Conservatives in the UK and the Liberals in Australia, came on as an advisor for the Tories' sinking campaign. The issue of Syrian refugees, as well as each party's budget proposals, would be front and center in the next debate on September 17th, sponsored by the Globe and Mail. The second debate was not much different than the first one, with the exception of Elizabeth May missing. Harper attacked Mulcair and Trudeau on their budgets, and they did likewise against Harper, but also blasted him on the refugee issue. But again, it was another nationally televised debate where Trudeau was able to show yet again that he could hold his own on stage. While claiming that there was a clear winner would be hard, Trudeau was knocking down all the barriers of doubt surrounding his campaign in the early days. The next debate on September 24th was the Radio-Canada French language debate, with all 5 party leaders in attendance. During the debate, Mulcair and Trudeau went after each other and their economic policies, while, as Chantal Bears said, quote, "Harper laid back and got himself an easy ride," end quote. In the next debate, the Monk debate on foreign policy on September 28th, the debate was fierce and all 3 performed well. However, Trudeau might have been seen as the winner. According to Toronto Star journalist Tim Harper, quote, "Justin Trudeau, whose musings on foreign policy had cost him dearly in the past, delivered his best performance in a debate confined solely on foreign policy," end quote. The leaders' French debate and the Monk foreign policy debate had an impact in the polls, now making the Liberals the top party going into October. According to two Leger polls, one conducted before the French debate and the other conducted after the Monk debate, the NDP lost 10% in Quebec, with that vote moving to all parties. However, in Ontario, the Liberals were now looking like the clear frontrunners. In the first poll, the Liberals had only led Conservatives by 2% in the province. But in the second poll, the Liberals were now up by 5%. The Liberals also took the lead in British Columbia, where they had previously been third place. The final debate, the French language TVA debate, was held on October 2nd, with all sides doing well. But in this debate, journalists like Chantal Hébert said that Trudeau did much better in the second French debate than he had done in the first. And it showed. In the first Leger poll after the debates, the NDP and Liberals were now tied in Quebec, both at 28%, with the Liberals maintaining their lead in Ontario and getting even stronger in British Columbia. The momentum was on Trudeau's side. But there was one issue that was controversial, but one the Conservatives thought could win them seats in Quebec, and that was the issue of the nikab, the face covering for Muslim women, which only showed their eyes. Harper proposed that women should uncover their faces when working in civil service positions. This was a wedge issue, especially in Quebec, with most Quebecois agreeing with Harper, but not agreeing with Trudeau and Mulcair. But this issue hurt the NDP more than it hurt the Liberals. Remember, the NDP won the 2011 election by winning a ton of seats from the Bloc Québécois, who are voters who were opposed to the nikab in public service positions. Therefore, Mulcair had the most to lose. For Trudeau, his voters never considered this their main issue, thus didn't suffer in Quebec. In fact, La Presse, a major publication in Quebec, endorsed the Liberal Party for the first time since 2000. And it was at this point, just a week before the election, which was held on October 19th, that the Liberals were in the driver's seat. The NDP hadn't led a poll since September 17th. The last poll that the Conservatives led was an ECOS poll on October 10th. The remaining polls over the last 9 days had the Liberals in the lead. And with the NDP basically out of the running to form government, many who would normally vote for the NDP strategically voted for the Liberals to stop Stephen Harper. Now, to be honest, there wasn't much attention given to the election in the last week. That's because the Toronto Blue Jays were in the playoffs for the first time since they won the World Series in 1994. And as someone who lived in Montreal at the time of the election, and as well as a Blue Jays fan, I can testify that nearly everyone's attention was focused on the Blue Jays in the last week of the campaign. In fact, Game 3 of the American League Championship Series was played on Election Day in Toronto, with the amount of viewers being nearly the same for the election and the Blue Jays game. On election night, it was apparent almost immediately that it was not just going to be a big night for the Liberals, but a bad night for the NDP. 4 of the NDP's top names, Jack Harris, Megan Leslie, Robert Chisholm, and Peter Stauffer, who was known as being one of, if not the most in-touch MP with his constituents, lost. In fact, the Liberals swept every seat in Atlantic Canada. By the end of the night, the Liberals would win 184 seats, gaining 148 seats. The Conservatives lost 1/3 of their seats, finishing with 99 seats. The NDP were absolutely decimated, losing 51 seats, more than half of their caucus. Interestingly, many of the seats that they kept were in Quebec. 8 of those seats were pickups by the Bloc Québécois. And that's it. That's the 2015 Canadian election. If you would like to watch my video about the 1993 Canadian election, you can check that out with the video on the left. Again, I want to thank all of my Patreon members who make this channel possible, and you can join them with the link down in the description. I'll see you in the next video, and bye for now.